I would now like to welcome our special guest, Professor David Flint, who has co-authored a book, Give Us Back Our Country, and we certainly want it back, that's for sure, David. David's Order of Australia, constitutional lawyer, chaired the ABC, and written other books, and I've got the most admiration for you, David. I really have, so if you'd like to come up and hold the fort, that'll be good.
Thank you very much, Peter. And ladies and gentlemen, I do congratulate the politicians and political candidates who've come tonight to face the questions from the people, because above all what we want are politicians who are accountable. And you see the attitude, the arrogance of those in office by these little animals down the front here. Peter was talking about the sad state of agriculture in this country. In the federal court this week, one of the two duopolists in the retail food industry, Coles, and there are two of them, Coles and Woolworths, and they specialise in giving you probably the highest prices in the Western world for food, and they give the farmers probably the lowest prices, and they keep lowering the prices to the farmers. But Coles argued in the federal court, in a case brought by the ACCC, they argued that bread, fresh baked in store, marked fresh baked in store, could include bread which was 90% baked overseas and flown into Australia. And yet they dare brand it. They just finish it off and they say it's baked in store. Now, if that's the standard of truth that's being offered to the people of Australia, where are we going? Now, I'm going to come down now because there's a presentation and I can only see it by coming down. This is about a book, Give Us Back Our Country, which I and a young colleague have written, which I might think of it. And I'm trying to activate it. There's a feeling in this country that something is terribly wrong. People feel that their country, which they built, their ancestors built, and which our servicemen and women fought for and died for, is somehow being taken away from them. There's a feeling across the country that something is terribly wrong about the way you are governed, and something is. And that's why we've written this book, Give Us Back Our Country. We've tried to set out what we see as the problem, and I don't think anybody would have any difficulty in saying there's a terrible problem in the government of the states and the Commonwealth of this country. And we thought we'd put in a piece here, and I was talking to Porty a few minutes ago, and she was pointing out that children in the schools and people who've graduated from our schools, young people, don't know terribly much about what government is about, what Parliament does, how the states operate and so on. And she says they're not being taught about this. And she says, and I think rightly so, this is deliberate. It's to keep the people in ignorance. We not only say there's a problem, that there are principles of sound government, but we say in this book that there is a solution. There is a way in which we can make the politicians accountable, not every 3 or 4 years in confected elections, not every 3 or 4 years, but on every day of every month of every year. And that's how it should be. Our institutions at Federation were remarkable. We were in advance of the rest of the world. And they gave us a vibrant democracy, a democracy in which members of Parliament were chosen on merit, and they voted as they thought they should vote in the public interest, in the national interest. But since then, the system has been taken over by faceless men, by power brokers in both of the parties. This reaches its zenith in the state from which I've come, in which a former Minister of the Crown has been found by ICAC to have been involved in corruption in which he hoped to gain $100 million, and now ICAC is about to investigate former ministers in the present Liberal government. Corruption seems to be very big in New South Wales. Our system of government is neither open nor transparent nor really democratic. The parties have a rigorous control over membership. They limit the freedom of speech of the members of the party. In New South Wales, there's very strong rules by the Liberal Party stopping members of the Liberal Party from speaking freely to the press. The pre-selections are preordained. There is no doubt that in most pre-selections now, candidates are chosen for both parties, except in some states, and this state is an exception now, but in most pre-selections, the parties choose the candidate not for merit, but because of the loyalty of the candidate to a given power broker. This would not be tolerated in any other comparable democracy. It doesn't happen in any other Western democracy. We have, in this country, we've got developed an alliance between the power brokers, who are opportunist and unprincipled, and the inner city elites, that is, the heirs of Marx, who grasp every new fashion and adopt it and try to apply it to you. For example, in the fashion of sustainability, which is being applied over agricultural land across this country. What we say in the book is that so much of what government does, so much of what Parliament does, wouldn't pass the pub test. Now, I borrowed that from Alan Jones. Alan Jones frequently says that wouldn't pass the pub test. That is, it just wouldn't pass common sense, good judgement, and decency. If you ask people, for example, should governments, for example, send out cheques of $900 to everybody at a certain time in the government, is that a good idea? People would say, if you ask them in the pub, they say, I don't think that's a good idea. Or should they spend $96 billion doing what the private sector could do, that is, set up an NBN, National Broadband Network? People would say, no, that's probably something which should be left to business to run. It's difficult to think of a problem today which hasn't been created by the politicians. We have so many. For example, running down our defences. We know, for example, that the percentage of GDP spent on our defence fell dramatically under the previous three governments, that is the Gillard and the Rudd government, to a level about the same that we were spending in the 30s, just before the Second World War, when we were almost defenceless. You might remember that they centralised military prosecutions and they were going to try some young men who in Afghanistan were doing no more than their duty. They were going to be tried for some breach of some concocted law, and that was only stopped at the last minute. We know that our system of law and order in this country has in many places in Australia collapsed. Certainly in the city of Sydney it has, where drive-by shootings seem to occur nearly every night, and there's enormous indiscipline, a lack of law and order in the city. The whole criminal justice system seems to have been moved so that the pendulum has been moved away from protecting the victim to looking after the criminal. We've seen some outrageous cases concerning that in Sydney. We see declining school standards in comparison with the Asian countries. We are falling behind, particularly in mathematics and science. The news came out today that the OECD had found that the children of garbage men, garbos as we call them in Sydney, the children of garbos in Shanghai are doing better in mathematics than the most privileged children in Australia, where vast amounts of money are spent on their education. Now, why is that? It's because fashion has taken over education. The teaching unions have argued that small classes are the solution, whereas anybody of my age knows that discipline, sound teaching, and a good curriculum are the way to get results, not by grasping every new idea that's come in from overseas. As Peter said, there's a distinct failure to harvest water. We seem to have, within living memory, banned the building of new dams across Australia. We're still relying in Sydney on Warragamba, which was completed when I was a young man, for a city of 1 million. It's now a city of at least 5 million. We're still relying on the same dam. Governments just won't harvest water. We had a brilliant plan some years ago, the Beale plan, which was to divert water from the north, which is flowing into the sea, the north of New South Wales, to bring it over the mountains, as they did with Snowy River, and bring it into the Darling, so that the Darling would be always running and always full of fresh water. That plan was taken by the Fraser government. They set up an inquiry to see whether it was a viable project. When the Hawke government got in, they immediately canned that plan, which is not surprising because, as you know, there is a policy among the Greens and Labor, and the Liberals are too weak usually to change that, not to build any more dams in the country. The prevention of bushfires even is an area where the politicians have failed. In my state, and I'm sure it's similar in other states, they've stopped any action to prevent the build-up on the forest floors. They've done away with all of the things, all of the precautions which were taken in the past to stop bushfires. Then when the bushfires break out, they blame climate change. Roads, hospitals, controlling our borders, which may be being turned, protecting our farmers from diseases, the way that the quarantine is being dropped. A very important issue, and I'm sure this is one which affects this assembly, that is the stealing of property by the government, the neutralising of property, the most egregious example being that of the Spencer case. Remember Peter Spencer in New South Wales? He went up onto a tower on his farm. He was going to commit suicide. And the reason he was going to commit suicide was that the federal government, it was the Howard government entered into an agreement with the New South Wales government that to fulfil the quotas under the Kyoto Protocol. And remember, the Howard government wouldn't sign the Kyoto Protocol, but they decided that they would keep to the quotas of carbon emissions. To do this, they needed carbon sinks throughout the country. That's good land which had to be set aside so that it couldn't be used for the purpose of arguing to some international busybody that we were reducing our carbon emissions. The federal government entered into an agreement with the state government of New South Wales, which turned Peter Spencer's valuable farm into a useless carbon sink. They ruined him. And he's been in court. He's still in court. I think the case is coming up again in February. It goes up to the High Court, goes back to the federal court. Fortunately, there are people who are looking after his legal costs. But he has had his property effectively stolen from him because it's been made valueless through the actions of politicians. This is happening all over the country. We're finding it, for example, at the state level. We're finding it even at the municipal level. There are municipal councils in New South Wales which are waging a campaign to try and turn existing farms at some stage into wildernesses. It's happening in America too. The NBN, which was $96 billion spent on something without any cost-benefit analysis. The control of monopolies, which we see in relation to retail in America and Europe. No two oligopolists like Coles and Woolworths would be allowed to drive small business out, as they have done. For example, in their these things that you get, which you take to the garage and you get a tiny discount on your petrol. That's wiped out vast numbers of independent petrol proprietors throughout the country. They're trying to do the same with wine shops by giving you little pieces of paper which you can take to a Coles or Woolworths outlet and you get your bottle of wine cheaper. This is to extend Coles and Woolworths. It's to drive independent outlets out, and then they negotiate from strength lower prices from the person who makes the wine, from anybody in agriculture. And this is tolerated. In fact, it was legalised through the Trade Practices Act. And of course the massive build-up of public debt, which Peter's already referred to. We have the ceding of sovereignty, the Agenda 21, sinister Agenda 21, which is based on so-called sustainability. The long-term aim of that is to turn vast parts of this country, the United States and Canada, into wildernesses. It's to destroy agriculture. It's to squeeze us into cities without elevators, to take away our cars from it. It's quite clear. If you look at the Agenda 21 site of the United Nations, you'll see that this is the long-term aim. And it is based on an organisation in Germany, a United Nations organisation in Germany, which relates straight to local government. And a large number of local governments, both here and in the United States, have joined up, and they are secretively applying Agenda 21. We had a case in northern New South Wales where a farmer changed the use of his land in a very minor way. He left a field fallow for 1 year. He'd been growing corn there before. And the next year, he naturally decided he would put corn there again. The local government in northern New South Wales said, "Oh no, you can't do that. You're changing the use. You've got to make a development application to us." And that would cost several $1,000s with special advisors, and it would take a long time. This is just to go back to what he was doing the other year. Mental health is another example. Remember the Richmond report in New South Wales, copied in the other states. It was imported from the United States. The argument was that the big mental institutions were defective. Therefore, you turned those who are mentally ill into what would be called community houses. Well, of course, there were no community houses set up for this, properly managed. They were turned out into the streets. Vast numbers of homeless that you see in the streets of our cities are often the mentally ill. One of the latest examples of politicians misbehaving was in the last few months of the Gillard government, when they decided to hold a major press conference when they claimed that our major sports were infected by drugs. They held a big press conference about this in Sydney, and of course that made headlines around the world. It slandered every one of our athletes. It slandered all our sports. It went round the world, and what has happened since, when they've actually got round to investigating it and finding the few who were using drugs? The power brokers, from time to time, who run the political parties, have to admit, because you express your upset with governance in this country, the population says, well, there's something wrong. Can't we do something about this? And every so often they come up with one of their solutions, which are non-solutions. For example, they say, oh, the solution is to have fixed terms, and you've got them in this state. And it's a marvellous thing, because the government of the day can't decide when the election will be. Well, what improvement has that scored? Another one is longer terms. We were told if the politicians had more time between elections, they'd have more time to do things well. They wouldn't have to worry about the next election. Well, we've got 4-year terms in New South Wales, and we've just got rid of the most corrupt and incompetent government we've ever had in the state. And of course they are past masters in voter manipulation. In the 80s, they argued that they had to make voting easier, so they got rid of the subdivisions, so you could vote anywhere in your electorate, making it much easier to vote more than once because they wouldn't know you at the other voting stations. They've got rid of the rule that the rolls close on the day when the election is announced. They're left open for a week, and during that week, a tsunami of new registrations arrives at the Electoral Commission. They don't have the resources to check them, and anyway, a registration application can be signed in front of another voter. So they get a vast number. Well after the election, when the politicians send out by mail notices to people on the rolls, a vast number are returned unknown at this address. So there's an enormous attempt, enormous and very effective way of defrauding your vote by enrolling other people. This is probably bigger than multiple voting as a scandal. Then they say, oh, we'll abolish one tier of government, we'll get rid of states, or we'll get rid of local councils. And then they say, we'll introduce a new tier of government, let's have regional governments. This was the big thing of the Whitlam government, obviously to undermine the states. Or we'll increase the pay for politicians, because that will improve the standard of politicians that you get in Parliament. And I'm sure you will agree with me that the vast increase in political pay and in the early pensions at ages we're not allowed to take our superannuation, all that does improve, does it not, the quality of the politicians. And vastly increased staff, which helps. There was a wonderful decision taken by the Queensland government, Mr. Beattie. There was a proposal by an independent that they have citizen-initiated referenda and community cabinets, as they were called. Mr. Beattie said, well, I won't give you citizen-initiated referenda, but you can have community cabinets. So we have this bizarre, concocted thing of the cabinet going out to some country town and meeting there as though that is in any way an improvement in government. Because the one big thing, which I was involved in, the one big thing for solving the problems of government in this country was the time-consuming, expensive one the people rejected, the politicians' republic. The one they proposed, they put up a model, you might remember. It would have produced the only republic in the world, the only republic in history, where it would be easier for the Prime Minister to sack the President than his cook. The Prime Minister could sack the President without notice, without any grounds whatsoever, and without any appeal. And this, of course, was designed to get over the problem of 1975, that is, when Sir John Kerr withdrew the commission of the Prime Minister on the grounds that he was behaving unconstitutionally. Well, you rejected that, and good for you. The second part of this book, and I'll be very brief on this part, are on the principles, because we thought it important that these be put in the book, because, as you know, under the state curriculums and the national curriculum, whatever curriculum it is, children don't seem to be taught much about what our system is. And there is, in our system, a golden thread which goes back to the Magna Carta and comes to us through the Glorious Revolution, which established checks and balances on government, and down through the settlement to our federation. And that golden thread came to Australia with the 6 pillars. Governor Phillip brought 4 pillars to this country. He brought the English language, our Judeo-Christian values, which do not require that anybody belong to those religions, or indeed any religion, but expecting them to observe the values which are based in those religions. And he also brought the English language, and above all, he brought the rule of law. Within weeks of the foundation of the settlement, two convicts. Two convicts, husband and wife, brought an action in the court against the master of one of the ships for stealing some of their property. And the master was brought before the court, an open-air court no doubt, before the judge advocate, who fortunately wasn't a lawyer, he was a naval officer. And the judge advocate, having heard all the evidence, decided that the master had indeed stolen their property and gave an order against the master to repay them for the cost of their property. That was within a few weeks of the settlement of this country. The rule of law came to this country. The British did not, as one book argues, install a gulag here. Who ever heard in a gulag or a concentration camp the internees suing and getting damages for some wrong done to them? The sixth pillar of this country is something we designed ourselves. The constitution of this country, contrary to what Paul Keating claimed. Paul Keating said the constitution was written in the British Foreign Office for the British to keep control over it. Why he said the Foreign Office, I don't know. Surely it would have been the Colonial Office. But that's completely untrue. It was written in Australia by Australians, and it was approved by Australians in one of the first examples of the people themselves approving a constitution. It was a remarkable document. It has given us sound institutions, institutions which, I would say to you, have been seriously and abused by the oligopoly, the two major political parties which control this country. That federation which we were given, that very sound federation, has been seriously compromised. We are now the most fiscally, that means from a taxation point of view, the money flowing in, the most fiscally centralised federation in the Western world among comparable countries. In most countries, the central government takes 50% or so, a bit more than 50% of the taxes. Most federations work on that basis. In our country, Canberra takes 80%. 80%. They give money back to the states, that's true, but they do it under a section of the Constitution called Section 96, which allows the Commonwealth to give money on condition. In other words, they manipulate the states by saying, you can have this money, provided that you follow our policies in relation to sustainability and climate control and heaven knows what. All of that has to go as a condition with a grant of federal money. And you will remember that even though they're getting 80%, the last government tried to take even more when they tried to take the royalties, the mining royalties from the states, and centralise them in Canberra. We have an insatiable central government which shovels up all of the money, then dishes it out on conditions. And it's not a sustainable federation. It takes away the independence of the state governments, turns them into satellites, into puppets of the central government. How did this happen? How did we reach this stage? How did we let this happen? Two groups of people are to blame. Firstly, the politicians. That's not a photograph of an Australian political squabble. It's taken from another country. I thought it captured what goes on in Parliament. And the other people are the High Court judges. They're not High Court judges, they're British QCs, but you get the picture. They, the parliaments, the politicians, and the High Court have worked together to centralise our federation, to give it a meaning the people never intended, and if the people had been asked, they would have rejected it. And they know that the people would have rejected it, that's why they have reinterpreted the Constitution. It's interesting, one of the mistakes the Founding Fathers didn't make many mistakes, but one of the mistakes they made in relation to the High Court was to allow the appointment to be all at the federal level. In retrospect, what they should have done, it should have rotated. So you got Queensland appointing, New South Wales, Victoria. Each time there's a vacancy, it should rotate between the states. So you wouldn't get a High Court who sees everything through the refined views of members of the bar, the Sydney and Melbourne bars. You'd get a different view of Australia. Did you know there's never ever been a South Australian Justice of the High Court? Now, isn't that appalling? It's not as though you don't have lawyers of standing who could have been appointed. Most of the judges of the High Court have come from the Sydney and Melbourne bars. No academics have been appointed either, unlike the Canadian. I'm not asking for a job because I'm over the retiring age. There is, we believe, there is a solution. There is a solution to all this. It's very good to have independence. It's very good to have other parties. But power will probably remain in the hands of the principal parties. They have to be controlled. How can we control them? The point is, of course, you'll have to fight for it. I don't mean go out in the street, as they are in Venezuela or other countries. You have to fight for it in the refined and dignified way that we've always conducted our politics in this country. At least the people have. The thing is, we have to empower the people. They have to be able to do more than just give a blank cheque, which is what you do now. You give a blank cheque every 3 or 4 years to a group of politicians, and as we know from the previous government, they do exactly what they want to do, and hope you won't remember it at the next election. We have to make the politicians accountable, not every 3 or 4 years, but on every day of every week, of every month, and of every year. Just as nurses and doctors are, all working people and farmers. You're all accountable for what you do. You're accountable to somebody. You're accountable to your boss. You're accountable to your customers. You're accountable all of the time. Why shouldn't these people be accountable? And as you know, between elections, they're not. And they've rigged the elections. We should have a power to recall governments. It exists in the United States, in a number of states. In Australia, before the last election, in the New South Wales election, Mr. O'Farrell promised, he wrote a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald, arguing strongly about this. He promised he would have an inquiry into it. He set up an inquiry. Curiously, 2 of the people looked as though they'd be very much opposed to it. One was Professor Williams, a strong Labor Party man who would be opposed to this sort of thing. Anyway, curiously, by majority, the committee came down in favour of recall elections in New South Wales. When the Premier, or the Premier's office was asked about this on the Alan Jones show, the Premier's office told Alan Jones the inquiry had recommended against recall elections. They told a complete untruth about what happened, and that's been forgotten in New South Wales. The second thing that we should have, that kiss occurred when the carbon dioxide tax got through the House of Representatives. If you don't like their taxes, and you don't like their laws, you should be able to reject them. The Prime Minister of South Australia, as premiers were called in those days, Charles Kingston, the great Prime Minister of your state, came to the meeting in Sydney, which was to discuss the new constitution. He came with a printed provision in the constitution providing that if 20,000 electors or 2 states within a certain period after the passing of bills by the 2 houses called for a referendum, there had to be a referendum, and that referendum would decide whether the law would proceed, whether the bill would then go to the Governor-General. There was Charles Kingston. They talked him out of it and said, oh, the Westminster system will work, it'll make governments accountable, they won't pass laws that people don't want. Well, that may well have been so in those early years, when the 2 parties, under the control of the Powerbrokers, didn't control Parliament. It's not so today. The third thing, even more radical, is to allow the people to make laws that the people want. This works in Switzerland, it works in a number of American states. In Switzerland, the other weekend, they passed a referendum. It was a referendum raised by a petition. It was opposed by most of the establishment, and it was to reintroduce limits on immigration. About 1 in 5 people in Switzerland are immigrants. There wasn't opposition to immigration, but they objected to uncontrolled immigration from the European Union under an agreement entered into with the European Union. And they knew that more states would be joining the European Union, which would lead to a flood of immigrants into Switzerland. And people said, well, we should in John Howard's terms, we should decide who comes into this country and on what terms. Quite a reasonable thing. And they passed that by a majority. That one there, the minarets, that was a couple of years ago. Many Swiss people decided they didn't like, in small Swiss mountain villages, suddenly having a very high minaret built for Muslim prayers. They didn't mind the Muslims being there, didn't mind them having mosques, but objected to the minarets, the very tall minarets from which the prayers would go across the Alps, across the villages. I suppose they preferred to hear the cowbells and the yodeling that you expect in Switzerland. That was passed against the wishes of the establishment. In the field of law and order, you could have a referendum to say, well, we think that this sort of offence should have this sort of minimum penalty, rather than leaving it to the judges. You could have all sorts of things if you're allowed to make laws that the people want. There should also be party reform. The political parties extract vast amounts of money from you for each vote, which they force you to give. Voting, as you know, is compulsory, but for every vote they get an amount of money. Now, if they do that, if they're allowed exemptions from the privacy laws, which allow them to take information they get from you and store it on databases, you go and see a politician, you tell that politician you have some problem, a particular problem that affects a member of your family, they store that. They put that in a database so that when they're doing something in that area, they know that they can contact you and tell them what a marvellous job they're doing. Anybody else would not be allowed to keep those databases. The politicians can, because they put an exemption for themselves in their Privacy Act. They're exempted from aspects of the Electoral Act in relation to the rolls. You and I can't get access to the rolls, they can at any time. So they have all these advantages, vast financial advantages. They have exemptions from the laws. In return for that, shouldn't they have to be democratic? If you're a law firm and you're dealing with the Federal Attorney General, the Attorney General says, oh, you've got to comply with conditions. For example, you have to have so many women partners, you have to do so much pro bono work. These are conditions. Shouldn't we, be able to impose conditions on the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, telling them that they have to be open and transparent and democratic, that the members of those parties are worth more than just making scones and handing out pamphlets at elections, that those members should run the parties and decide democratically who should be their representative, both in the lower house and in the Senate. And with a system of direct democracy, that could be required by legislation. The politicians won't pass legislation to that effect. If an independent proposes it, they'll vote against it. Labour and the Liberals will join together. But we have parties which are undemocratic, run by power brokers, interested in money and interested in power, and that's how our political parties are run. It's something which would not be tolerated, not at all tolerated, in any similar democracy in the Western world. Yet we've got it in this country, and we were the most advanced country, almost one of the most advanced countries, in the late 19th century and at the time of Federation. We could even have citizen judges. We could bring back that old English institution, the grand jury, which works in America. The great advantage of the grand jury is that they're secret, they have a power to call witnesses and compel the production of documents. They can recommend a prosecution, but above all, they're like royal commissions of citizens. But above all, they operate without government telling them to operate. A royal commission has to be established by the government of the day. So if there's some outrage, for example, remember building the education revolution, the BER? It's estimated that about $5 billion was lost in improper payments from the 15 or so billion involved in that. What did the Gillard government do? They didn't appoint a royal commission, because a royal commission can compel people to give evidence. They can compel the production of documents. So they set up a quiet inquiry. I make no criticism of the man involved, but they set up an inquiry which was completely powerless. Even he found that $1.5 billion was lost. Imagine if they had a proper inquiry, like the one that's going to be held into corruption in trade unions. If they had a proper inquiry, imagine what they would have discovered. Well, in America, they have grand juries, which can form their own agenda, which can do their own inquiries. It's an old English institution. You know, we had it in Victoria. It wasn't used much. But then some smart person a few years ago decided that they would bring a matter before, they'd ask for a grand jury to be convened in Victoria, to be empanelled, and they went to court for that, and what they wanted to do was to have the grand jury investigate whether Julia Gillard had committed treason. Well, the Victorian government, the Victorian DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, as he can under their Act, took over the investigation and closed it down immediately, and the Victorian government rushed through Parliament a bill to abolish grand juries in Victoria. But they're a very interesting thing which we should have. We propose a way of doing this. The first thing, of course, there has to be a groundswell of feeling across the country that we need to investigate this at least. And the way to do this, we say, is to set up or elect a convention under what is called the Corowa Plan. The Corowa Plan came from a People's Conference in 1893. It was established by people concerned about the fact that federation seemed to be going nowhere, because once the convention was held and a constitution drafted, once it went back to the state or colonial parliaments, they tore it apart. They never agreed on it. There could never be any agreement. At Corowa, a great man, Sir John Quick, whose name should be known to every school child in this country, but of course isn't. Sir John Quick is in many ways with Parkes, the father of Federation, because if Parkes was the one who pushed it, Quick was the one who designed the process. And his process was elect a convention, and the states agree in advance that whatever the convention adopts after consultation with the states must be put to the people in referendums. So the final decision would be left to the people. That's what's needed. We need a convention, an elected convention, to decide on what are the problems and what are the solutions. And we need that to be put to the people, perhaps in a number of referendums. One, for example, on the recall of governments, one on vetoing governments' legislation, one even on proposing our own legislation. We propose a new Corridor process. We see the convention as an inexpensive process. We see it as one which would operate through committees. We do strongly recommend that delegates not be paid. Nobody who's wanting an income from it should be there. And we think it should be empowered to submit its recommendations to the people. The only way to make people accountable is in this way. There has to be a groundswell for it. The politicians won't do this alone. There has to be, from the ordinary people of Australia, through talkback, through the internet, through letters and so on, there has to be pressure for this. We see this as the solution, and we have a site. There's a book that you can buy if you want it. But most importantly, there's a site, cando.org.au. We would love you to go onto that site and put your names and email, and we'll keep you in touch. We want to develop a groundswell so that some people in the media will support this, particularly in talkback, so that as people realise that they're not getting that much from government, they may get better governments, but there will be another day, there'll be another time, when a confidence trick will again be put on you, and a government as bad as the last will be elected, and they will prove even more incompetent, even more profligate than the last one. Thank you.